gentle touch in the silence of the living room shattered the unspoken barriers between us, changing everything in an instant. That moment remains vivid in my mind, as if it only happened recently. I saw myself as a mother, a wife, the force holding everything together. But how easily we trick ourselves into believing things are flawless until they unexpectedly fall apart. It was an ordinary evening at home. My husband, Andrew, had once again stayed late at work. I had become accustomed to his frequent absences, persuading myself that he was merely working hard for our family's benefit. Yet, deep inside, I felt the growing chasm between us. Andrew hadn't looked at me with bright eyes for years. We had become like strangers, orbiting each other without truly connecting. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, I pondered the life I had created, the life I was now questioning. My son, Martin, had recently turned 19 and was entering his college sophomore year. He had stayed with us for the summer, but unlike the distant bond I shared with Andrew, Martin and I had grown close, perhaps closer than many mothers and sons. I had always taken pride in being his confidante, the person he could turn to for anything. However, something had shifted in Martin recently. He had become distant, more guarded, and I yearned for the connection we once had. I wanted him to confide in me, to be open, to let me in as he used to. Maybe it was selfish, but in some way, Martin filled a gap that Andrew never could. One evening, Martin came home later than usual, his clothes faintly scented with cologne and something unfamiliar. I looked up as he entered, his expression unreadable. "Hey, Mom," he greeted softly. "Hey, Han," I replied, my voice faltering. "Long day," he nodded, setting his bag down. "Yeah, just needed some air, I guess." There was something in his tone that made me pause, a heaviness. He directed his gaze at the floor, his hands burrowed deep in his pockets. For a moment, I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but I hesitated. The story didn't end there. The following days were a confusing mix of silent exchanges and incomplete thoughts. Andrew was often absent, and even when he was home, he seemed preoccupied. It felt like the foundation of our family was being uprooted, leaving me off balance. Andrew, once my partner in everything, was now a stranger, and I found myself feeling utterly alone at home. One evening, after Andrew left for a business dinner that I suspected was something else, I decided to approach Martin. He was sitting on the porch, staring into the night. I joined him on the steps, the chilly air sending a shiver through me. "Martin, are you okay?" I asked softly. He turned to me, eyes intense yet shadowed. He studied my face before finally saying, "I don't know, Mom. Sometimes I feel like I don't belong here, like I'm somehow out of place." His words hit me hard. I couldn't believe Martin felt this way, not here, not with me. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, sensing the stiffness in his muscles. "You'll always belong here," I whispered. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, as if finally releasing unsaid burdens. "Thanks, Mom," he murmured. For a moment, silence enveloped us, heavy with the words left unspoken. But this calm didn't last. Days merged into weeks as summer drew to a close, and the strain in my marriage became more pronounced. Andrew was rarely home and seemed to be hiding something from me. I glimpsed unfamiliar names in his messages. Mel. When I questioned him, he brushed it off as a colleague, dismissing my concerns. But deep down, I knew better. The truth dawned slowly, like puzzle pieces falling into place. Andrew was unfaithful. Though I lacked evidence, my instincts were clear. He'd grown cold, detached, uninterested in me or our family. Ironically, amid this turmoil, Martin was my only steadfast support. My son became my anchor in this sea of uncertainty. One evening, with Andrew gone again, Martin and I sat for dinner. The house felt strangely empty without Andrew, yet in some ways it was a relief. No pretense, no facade of a perfect family. Martin immediately sensed my mood, concern lining his gaze. "You okay, Mom?" he asked gently. I hesitated, burdened by everything I'd kept inside. But Martin deserved honesty. "No," I confessed quietly. "I think your father is seeing someone else." He regarded me silently, then reached across the table to hold my hand, grounding me with his warmth. "Mom, you deserve so much more," he assured me, his eyes unwavering. Tears threatened, but I held them back. "Thank you, Martin. You have no idea what that means to me," I replied. That night, as I lay in bed, my thoughts returned to his words, the reassurance in his eyes, and I realized how much I needed him, how he'd become my reason to persist. But matters didn't end there. If anything, they became more complex. The days following were laden with a tension I couldn't articulate. Martin and I spent more time together than ever, exchanging conversations about our dreams, fears, and regrets. He confided in me about school pressures, the expectations to be flawless, and I shared my fears, doubts, and pain from a faltering marriage. Gradually, something shifted between us. It began subtly, a glance lingering a moment too long, a touch lasting just a bit more than necessary, a smile that seemed more meaningful. I knew it was wrong, that I was overstepping a boundary, but I couldn't resist. Martin was there in a way Andrew never was, and in my loneliness, I clung to him. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, his hand brushed against mine. A small, seemingly innocent gesture, yet the spark it ignited was anything but innocent. I glanced at him, our eyes met, and I knew things had irrevocably changed. The lines between us had blurred beyond reversal. That moment on the couch replayed in my mind, haunted me, the lingering touch of Martin's hand against mine. The gesture seemed harmless, perhaps, but it stirred a sense of unease within me. It felt as though we had silently breached an invisible boundary. A part of me longed to erase the incident, to act as if it had never transpired. Yet, each time I attempted to push it aside, the recollection returned, steadfast as my heartbeat. The connection between Andrew and me had grown distant, with him seeming oblivious to my presence. Days morphed into weeks filled with missed meals, lopsided conversations, and unreturned messages. I found myself increasingly turning to Martin, craving the company of someone who acknowledged my existence and genuinely cared. As I sought solace in him, he did the same in return. I hadn't realized how much he, too, had been ensnared by the strain that had overtaken our household. We shared a mutual loneliness, a shared pain that unexpectedly drew us closer. One night, as we sat at the dinner table enveloped in silence, Andrew was away again, no surprise there, and the unspoken words seemed to weigh heavily on us. Looking at Martin, his face obscured in shadows cast by the dim lighting, I felt a mix of guilt and an emotion I dared not name. "I just don't get it, Mom," Martin finally voiced, shattering the silence. "How can he just leave you like this? Doesn't he see what he has?" I had no answer. I'd posed the same question to myself countless times. "I don't know, Martin," I whispered softly. "Maybe I'm simply not enough for him anymore." Martin's expression darkened, his gaze intense as it fixed upon me. "That's not true. You're more than enough. He just doesn't see it." His words struck deeper than anticipated, imbuing me with an unexpected sense of validation. I couldn't recall the last time someone regarded me with such appreciation and care. Andrew certainly hadn't. In that moment, seated in the kitchen's quiet, a warmth spread through me that I'd not felt in years. Instinctively, I reached over, placing my hand on his for comfort, a simple gesture between mother and son. Yet the jolt of electricity as our skin met surprised me. Martin didn't recoil, nor did I. We remained there, hands clasped, the silence thickening with each passing beat. However, I couldn't let myself get lost in this. Not this way. I withdrew my hand, heart racing, burdened by the significance of what had just occurred. I'm sorry, Martin," I mumbled, feeling a flush creep up my cheeks. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head, his eyes never leaving mine. "You don't have to apologize, Mom. It's okay." His understanding gaze made it all the harder for me to bear. I stood abruptly, muttering something about needing to tidy up, seeking distraction to dispel the tension. I sensed his gaze tracking me as I busied myself in the kitchen, hands trembling over dishes, thoughts racing. The days that followed brimmed with an unspoken tension between us, one we dared not acknowledge. I'd catch him watching me from the periphery, his eyes lingering a moment too long. Each time brought that same warmth, a rush of something forbidden. I knew it was wrong, knew I needed to halt it, but truth be told, I didn't want to. Years spent feeling invisible, unwanted, unloved, and now, for once, I felt truly seen. One evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, the front door creaked open. Expecting Andrew, I looked up to see Martin instead, his expression troubled. "Hey, Mom," he greeted, voice gentle as he shut the door. "Hey, Martin," I replied, striving for a light, casual tone though tension simmered beneath. "Everything okay?" He hesitated, casting his gaze downward before meeting my eyes. "Can we talk?" I nodded, setting the laundry aside, patting the couch beside me. He joined me, his presence close, palpable warmth emanating from him. For a moment, silence stretched between us, dense and weighty. "I don't know how to say this," he murmured, voice barely breaking the quiet, "but I feel like I can't talk to anyone else about this." My heart raced, uncertain where this was headed. "You can talk to me, Martin, you know that," he nodded, drawing a deep breath. "It's just, I've been feeling things I don't understand, and I don't know who to talk to about it. I don't even know if I should be feeling this way." His vulnerability cut deep, and I wished to comfort him, assure him it was okay, that his feelings were normal. Yet part of me knew that was only partially true. Our boundaries had blurred, and halting it seemed beyond my capability. I placed a hand on his shoulder, and he leaned into the touch, resting his head there. We lingered like that for what seemed an eternity, silence speaking volumes. His heartbeat resonated through my arm, his breath warm on my neck, and I realized things had gone too far. There was no turning back. As days passed, our tension only mounted. I found myself yearning for those shared moments, the stolen glances, fleeting touches that lingered just slightly too long. It was a dance, each of us pushing boundaries until something would inevitably give. Meanwhile, Andrew remained oblivious, too absorbed in his world to notice the brewing storm beneath his nose. One night, while preparing for bed, a gentle knock on my door caught my attention. Heart skipping, I knew it was Martin before even opening it. I hesitated, hovering over the doorknob, but an internal urge compelled me to open it. There he stood, gazing at me with an intensity that sent a shiver through me. "Mom," he whispered, voice barely audible. I can't stop thinking about you." "About us." His words lingered, charged and heavy, momentarily taking my breath. I knew it was wrong, knew we'd crossed an irrevocable line, but in that instant, I couldn't care less. I was unconcerned with consequences, with implications. All that mattered was him and the way he saw me as the lone soul in the world. "Martin," I whispered back, voice shaking. "We can't. This isn't." But my words faltered as he moved closer, reaching out to touch my face. His touch was gentle, tentative, fearing I might retreat, but I couldn't. Each look, every incidental touch, every moment together seemed to draw us deeper into something we both knew was wrong, yet couldn't bring ourselves to end. There existed an undeniable, unsaid connection between us that neither could dismiss. I tried to distract myself with trivialities, hoping to subdue these emotions, to bury them where they couldn't resurface. But it was futile. Every time I entered a room and saw him, I was met with a familiar warmth, a longing that left me breathless. It didn't help that Andrew remained absent, absorbed in his life beyond our home, leaving me to face this growing storm alone. One evening, after Andrew departed for yet another late night at work, I wandered into the living room where Martin sat. He was relaxed on the couch, flipping channels, his demeanor completely calm. When he noticed me, something changed. His gaze softened, filling with an intensity that set my heart racing. "Hey, Mom," he greeted, his voice soft and inviting. "Couldn't sleep." I shook my head, feeling suddenly shy, unsure why. "Just couldn't focus, I guess. Thought I'd see if you were still up." He smiled, gesturing to the empty spot beside him. "Come sit. I was about to start a movie. Maybe it'll help you unwind." I hesitated, but the warmth in his eyes made me feel at ease, like everything between us was somehow right. I moved over, settling next to him, feeling the cushion shift as he inched closer. He was so near I could sense the heat from him, a steady warmth bridging the space between us. We watched in silence as the movie played, the light casting gentle shadows on his face. I occasionally stole glances at him, noting how his eyes were glued to the screen, his lips curving into a small smile at funny moments. I couldn't help thinking about how much he'd matured, changed, become someone more than just my son. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, leaving me in a state of confusion. As the film continued, I felt his hand move beside mine, his fingers entwining with mine in a gesture that felt both comforting and forbidden. I didn't withdraw. Instead, I sank into the warmth of his touch, my heart racing as his thumb traced the back of my hand. I knew I should intervene, should say something to break the spell we were under, but I couldn't. I was too immersed, craving the feeling of being wanted, of being cared for. When he turned to gaze at me, eyes dark with an emotion I dared not name, a shiver ran down my spine. "Mom," he murmured, his voice just above a whisper. "I can't stop thinking about you, about us." His words lingered between us, heavy with meaning, and my heart faltered. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only able to stare at him, my mind awash with countless emotions. Part of me wanted to escape, to halt this before it advanced. Yet another part, the part that had been so lonely, so starved for affection, yearned to remain, to discover where this journey might take us. "Martin," I whispered, my voice shaking. We can't." But the words faded as he leaned in, his face almost touching mine. I felt his breath warm against my skin, and before I realized, his lips met mine. At first, the kiss was gentle, tentative, as if fearing I might pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into him, allowing the kiss to deepen, losing myself in the moment. His hand tenderly cradled my face, his fingers brushing my cheek, making my heart flutter. The kiss was soft, unhurried, filled with a tenderness I'd longed for. It was everything I craved, everything I'd missed, and I couldn't bring myself to end it. Lost in the torrent of emotions, in the feeling of being wanted, of being truly seen, I let the kiss deepen, felt his other hand move to my waist, drawing me in until there was no space left between us. My thoughts were scattered, overwhelmed by the rhythmic beat of his heart next to mine, his warmth, and the softness of his lips. I understood it wasn't right, but at that point, it was irrelevant. All that mattered was the two of us and the sensation of being fully alive. However, the kiss couldn't last forever. Gradually, and somewhat unwillingly, we separated, both of us gasping, our faces flushed with a mix of thrill and guilt. We stared at each other for a while, the reality of our actions settling over us like a heavy cover. I saw the same uncertainty and fear in his eyes as what I felt, realizing this wouldn't be easy and that we had begun a journey from which we couldn't turn back. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, barely audible. "I didn't intend to. I don't know." I shook my head, taking his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. "Martin," I uttered softly, "you don't need to apologize. I wanted it too." The confession lingered between us, a delicate truth we both understood but had been too afraid to speak out. A curious sense of relief washed over me, as though a burden I hadn't noticed before was now lifted off my shoulders. We had overstepped boundaries, yes, but at least now our position was clear. At least we didn't have to conceal anymore, but the relief was fleeting. In the following days, the tension between us only intensified. Every glance, every touch, Every shared moment seemed heavier, carrying an expectation that left us both uneasy. I caught myself looking forward to our time together, the fleeting glances, the brief touches lingering just a fraction too long. With Andrew still away, unaware of everything, it felt like we were in a bubble, a universe where it was just us, free to explore emotions we had hidden for so long. One night, as I prepared for bed, I heard a gentle knock on my door. My heart skipped, realizing even before I answered that it was Martin. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but something urged me to open it. He was there, looking at me with an intensity that sent chills through me. "Mom," he whispered, his voice soft. "I can't stop thinking about that night, about us." The words sent a thrill through me, a mix of excitement and fear. I knew it was wrong, knew we were venturing into dangerous territory. But I couldn't resist. I stepped aside to let him in. As the door closed behind him, my heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with anticipation. We stood there, facing each other, the air thick with tension. I felt his gaze, the warmth of his presence, and in that moment, everything else faded away. He touched my cheek and I leaned into it, closing my eyes as his lips softly met mine. The kiss began gently, cautious, as if he were testing the waters. But as our lips connected, a surge of emotions, dormant for years, awakened. A warmth that left me breathless, my heart pounding. We moved together, lost in our embrace, captured by our intense connection. Time paused as we succumbed to the moment, our lips harmonizing perfectly. The world disappeared, all fears and worries diminished in significance. Our hearts synchronized, lost in each other's eyes, our love radiating brighter than anything else. But reality crashed back with a wave of guilt as we separated, breathless, our faces flushed with mixed excitement and shame. I knew this couldn't continue, knew we were walking a perilous path, but at that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was how he made me feel, the way he looked at me like I was the only person existing. We were both aware it was wrong, yet at that moment, nothing seemed to matter. Caught up in the excitement of what was forbidden, we ignored any potential repercussions. The aftermath of that night was an emotional whirlwind. Each glance from Martin and every fleeting touch seemed to ignite a spark inside me that I couldn't extinguish, no matter how I tried. Yet, the harsh reality of our actions began to sink in, the burden of it a constant reminder of the precarious path we were treading. Our discussions about that night were scarce, with both of us lost in our own thoughts, battling between longing and remorse. Andrew remained clueless, immersed in his own life, unaware of the shadowy secret growing between us. Every time I looked at him, I felt both relieved and ashamed, knowing that he had no clue about the underlying situation. One evening, after a day spent pretending as if all was normal, I found myself in the kitchen, washing dishes while staring out the window. The house was silent as Andrew was still out for yet another business dinner that I had ceased to question. I sensed footsteps behind me, and I knew without looking that it was Martin. His presence was as familiar as my own heartbeat, intensifying the tension as he approached. He stood beside me, stopping my motions by placing his hand on mine. Our eyes met, mirroring the tumultuous emotions we both felt. We stood there for a prolonged moment, the silence between us thick with everything unsaid. "Mom," he murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep going on like this. It's tearing me apart." The vulnerability in his words broke something within me, releasing a torrent of emotions, love, guilt, and fear. I wished to comfort him, to assure him everything would be all right, but the words evaded me. Deep down, I knew there was no simple resolution, no way to undo our actions. "Martin," I whispered, my voice quivering. "We can't keep doing this. It's not right." He nodded, his hand remaining over mine, his gaze piercing. "I know, but it's like I can't stop. Every time I try to create distance between us, I only end up wanting to be closer. I'm lost." I withdrew my hand, feeling the chill where his warmth had been, a reminder of the needed distance. "Perhaps we need some space," I suggested, the bitter taste of the words lingering. "Maybe that's the only way to halt this before it worsens." His eyes, filled with pain, met mine. "If that's what you want, Mom, if you believe that's best." I longed to tell him it was far from what I desired, but I knew it was our only option, continuing as we were meant, risking everything. The weight of our actions was too overwhelming, too perilous, and stopping now was our only chance to preserve what we had left. The following days were some of the toughest I'd ever faced. Martin and I kept our distance, retreating into our separate worlds, the silence between us deafening. His absence was palpable, a void that reminded me of all we had lost. Yet I knew this was the only path forward. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, Andrew returned home earlier than usual. He looked at me, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. The atmosphere was filled with tension, an unspoken unease hovering between us. My heart was racing as he approached and sat down next to me. "We need to talk," he stated, his voice calm yet icy. "I sense something is happening, and it's time we stop pretending everything is fine." A sinking feeling hit me. Panic surged through as I realized he wasn't fully aware of the truth, yet his glance suggested he suspected something and was unwilling to ignore the issues in our marriage any longer. "I acknowledge I've been distant," he admitted, staring at the ground. "But I believed our bond was strong enough to overcome these challenges. I thought you'd remain, waiting for me, but perhaps I was wrong." His words struck like a blow, underscoring the deterioration in our relationship and the sacrifices I'd made out of love. I yearned to reveal everything, to confess and seek his forgiveness, but I couldn't. The truth would be complicated and painful, capable of destroying us both. "Andrew, I don't know what to say," I whispered. "This isn't what I intended." He looked at me with a hardened, unyielding gaze. "Perhaps that's our issue," he noted, with bitterness I hadn't heard before. "Maybe we lost the desire for each other a long time ago, and neither of us would acknowledge it." The silence that followed was overwhelming, reminding us of all the unsaid things and how far we had drifted apart. I knew our marriage was beyond repair. In that instant, a sense of relief washed over me, a release from the ties to a life I no longer desired. In the days that followed, Andrew and I navigated the process of separation. There were legal proceedings, paperwork, and lengthy discussions that felt more like negotiations than anything else. It was difficult, yet liberating. For the first time in many years, I could breathe and be myself, even if that meant starting anew on my own. Martin and I kept our distance, acknowledging that the line we crossed could never be retraced. The furtive looks and whispered confessions in the dark ended. We made our choice and had to face the consequences. Months went by, each day taking me further from my former life. I moved into a smaller house, my own space to rebuild and find peace. Being alone felt unfamiliar after so many years, but it was also a relief, an opportunity to start over without being weighed down by the past. One evening, as I sat on my new porch watching the sunset, a sense of calm enveloped me. The decisions and mistakes I'd made were part of who I was, part of my journey, but they did not define me. I was prepared to forge ahead, leave the past behind, and welcome whatever the future might bring. As the last light of day slipped into night, a fragile hope emerged within me. A quiet hope that one day I could find peace. The path forward was unclear, full of uncertainties. Yet for the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace it.